In this video I'm going to design and make a simple sanding block. I've never owned a sanding block before, I've always just sanded by hand, but I wanted to make one just to see if I'd find it useful and see if it's something that I will use going forward. And spoiler alert, I can tell you now that since I built this I've used it loads. It's nice just to be able to grab this and start sanding, and it gives me a really nice and consistently flat finish. It works great. I designed my sanding block for the types of abrasive paper that I buy a lot of. I usually buy a big roll of 100 grit abrasive paper. I like the stuff by Klingspor. This isn't an advert, it's not sponsored, but after years of buying cheap sandpaper that rips far too easily, this stuff is great quality and it's not too expensive, and it also lasts ages too. And 100 grit for me is a bit of a sweet spot in my opinion. It's the grit I definitely use the most. These rolls are 115mm in width. The other abrasive papers I use a lot are various grits of wet and dry paper. These come in A4 sheets and I cut them down the centre lengthways to store them, and these are 115mm wide too, so I designed my sanding block to hold that width of paper. I used up some small scraps of plywood for this build. I had this piece of 12mm thick ply and I ripped it to 85mm at the table saw. Then I set up a stop block at 150mm at the mitre station and cut two pieces to that length. With my combination square set to 15mm, I scribed a line from each end on one of the pieces, and then I marked up a centre line and I used an awl to create a centre point. I grabbed a 2mm drill bit and I'd used the drill press to drill some pilot holes through both boards at the same time, and I'm holding them firmly so that they stay flush with one another. I'm going to be using these M6 bolts to hold the two boards together, and I measured the distance from the head to the threads, which was about 8mm, and also the width of the head, which was around 15mm. I grabbed a 15mm Forstner bit to drill out the pilot holes to create clearance holes for the heads of the bolts in one of the boards, and I wanted to drill the holes deep enough to accommodate the heads but without drilling all of the way through the board. Then I grabbed a 6mm drill bit and re-drilled the holes through both boards to accommodate the shaft of the bolts. On first attempt, my clearance holes were not quite deep enough. You can see the tip of the head of the bolt protruding slightly, so I drilled a little deeper and then it looked good. I could then add nuts to secure the bolts to the board with the clearance holes in. I mixed up some epoxy, added some masking tape to cut down on mess, and cut away where the holes were so that I could add the epoxy, which will serve two purposes. It will lock the heads of the bolts in place, and it will also act as a filler to make the surface flush with the face of the plywood. Once the epoxy had cured, I removed the tape and sanded it flush. And then I could add some of this craft foam which I picked up from my local craft shop. This was really cheap, 79p for an A4 sheet, and it's probably about 2mm thick. I added epoxy to what would be the base of the sanding block over where the holes had been filled earlier, and then put it onto the foam with some weights applied. After about 15 minutes I used a knife to cut the excess foam away. Next I turned my attention to the other board and I drilled some clearance holes to fit around the nuts that I'd added to the bolts. It would have made more sense to drill these before the 2mm pilot holes had been drilled out to 6mm, and that's why you can see the Forstner bit wandering a bit, but it worked out okay. This step might not have been needed though, because now that the heads of the bolts were now held in place with epoxy, the nuts may not be necessary, but I decided to keep them on there for extra strength, and as you can see the clearance holes now allow the top board to seat fully onto the bottom board. The final component I needed to make was the handle, so I went looking through my scraps and found a short piece of oak. For the handle, I kept things super simple. I just ripped all 4 corners at 45 degrees using the table saw. I could have made a much fancier handle than this, but I didn't want to waste too much time on it because at this stage I didn't even know if I would actually make use of the sanding block once it was finished. But actually this handle turned out just fine. While it's not the best looking, it's plenty comfortable enough to use. After cutting the handle to 80mm in length at the mitre saw, I added glue, placed it in the centre just by eye, and weighed it down and waited for it to dry. The 2 boards would get holed together using these M6 wing nuts, and I added them here so that I could figure out how much I could trim off the length of the bolts. I used a hacksaw to cut them to length, and then I eased over the sharp edges with a file. After some final sanding of the handle, I applied a couple of coats of spray varnish just to add a bit of protection to the wood so that it's easier to keep clean in future. I could then cut the abrasive paper to length with a knife and then fold the edges around the sanding base, which is the bottom board of the sanding block, and it helps to fold these creases nice and tight. And then I can add the top part of the sanding block, which sandwiches the edges of the sandpaper in between the 2 boards. And then the wing nuts hold everything in place tightly. And to finish off, I added my maker's mark to the handle. So like I said at the start, this sanding block works brilliantly, and I'm going to be using this all the time, so you'll see it in lots of my future videos. Shortly after making it though, it fell off the workbench and the handle broke off. I probably didn't leave the glue long enough to set, so I ended up scraping off the old glue. I added new glue and added a couple of countersunk screws from the underside, so now it's not going anywhere. This was a really quick project to build. It took a couple of hours, I think, from start to finish. That's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe if you haven't already for more weekly woodworking videos, and thank you for watching.